We're going to stay on the air for as long as possible. All we can say is what we've been repeating all morning. Get to any kind of underground shelter.
If the rapture happened in the next 60 seconds, some of you would suddenly disappear. Some of you would be left behind. I'm going to focus on the next coming of Jesus, which is the rapture of the church. Why? Because it concerns you, and it concerns every member of your family. I am not foolish enough to believe that everyone in this room is ready to meet Jesus Christ and to give an account for him instantly about your life. Here's the message of St. Paul. Let's begin at the beginning. 1 Corinthians 15, 51 and 52. Paul says, behold, I show you a mystery. Listen, the word mystery in the Bible does not mean something that's difficult to understand. It means something that has never been described before and is now being revealed. Paul says, behold, I show you a mystery. We shall not all sleep in death, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye. At the last trumpet, for the trump of God shall sound, and the dead in Christ shall be raised incorruptible, and we shall be changed into immortality. Pastor Hagee, what difference does it make whether I believe in the rapture or not? I get asked that question often. And the difference is Hebrews 9:28. To those that eagerly look for him, will he appear the second time? The point is, if you're not looking for him, you're not going with him. That's the point. Watch and pray that you be counted worthy to escape those things coming upon the earth. Will there be a rapture? If Jesus is coming back, why now? 2 Peter 3 and 2. Knowing that there shall come in the last days scoffers, saying, where's the sign of his coming? The very fact that you don't believe he's coming is proof positive he's coming.
Blessed is the man that endureth temptation, for when he is tried, he shall receive the crown of life which the Lord hath promised to them that love him. Let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man.
With tears in their eyes and death to America on their lips, thousands in Iran mourn the death of Qasem Soleimani. Their sorrow quickly turned to anger. A former commander of Iran's Revolutionary Guards warns the great nation of Iran will take a harsh revenge on the government of the U.S. That revenge may start Sunday when the Iraqi parliament meets to vote whether to kick all U.S. troops out of the country for launching the missile strike that killed Soleimani.
Breaking news. In a major escalation in tensions between the U.S. and Iran, the top Iranian general has been killed in an airstrike while leaving the Baghdad airport. The Pentagon confirmed the U.S. military carried out the attack. Qasem Soleimani was one of the most powerful figures in the Middle East and had been the top military man in Iran for more than 20 years. This attack comes after Iranian-backed groups breached the U.S. embassy in Baghdad just 2 days ago. We now turn to ABC's Kara Phillips, who's with President Trump in West Palm Beach, Florida. Kara.
When reports of the airstrike at the Baghdad airport broke tonight, there was one question on everyone's mind. Was the United States responsible? Well, the president was cryptic. He responded with only a picture, tweeting out the image of the American flag. My White House sources were able to confirm that not only did the strike happen, but it was ordered by President Trump. The Pentagon announcing that the strike did indeed kill the powerful commander of Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, Qasem Soleimani, as well as the head of an Iranian-backed Iraqi militia. And it was ordered by President Trump. Now, here in the U.S., Republicans are calling this a success, saying Trump made a brave and correct call, but the president is also facing questions from his critics on Capitol Hill, asking if the United States carried out the assassination without authorization from Congress, potentially bringing this country to the brink of an all-out war.
Thousands of our forces still stationed overseas. Many military families are watching the ramped-up rhetoric from North Korea very closely.
It's something that all Arizona families should be talking about right now, because more military leaders say if we go to war, it is highly likely we'd have to bring back the draft. Nicole Kreitz has the story you will only see on 3 TV.
Greetings from the President of the United States. Your friends and neighbors have selected you to represent them in the armed forces of the United States.
Jeff Mellinger was 19 when he got a letter.
The return address was the White House, Washington, D.C., and that was before zip codes.
That changed his life.
You are hereby ordered to report for induction no later than 0700 hours, 18 April 1972.
He left his job laying drywall to join Army Jump School. And instead of doing his time and getting out as fast as he could, he re-enlisted and joined the elite Army Rangers. He served nearly 40 years, rising in the ranks to retire as Command Sergeant Major in charge of Allied forces in Iraq.
I loved it, and I miss it every day. My knees and back may not, but I do.
He survived 27 roadside bombs in 34 months in Iraq and retired 6 years ago, the last enlisted draftee in continuous active duty.
39 years, 8 months, and 13 days.
So will he truly be the last?
Since the draft ended, is now the first time with what's happening in North Korea that you've considered it might be time to bring that back?
If something seriously happened on the Korean Peninsula, end of the day, you can only fly so many airplanes and launch missiles, and then what do you got to do? Somebody's still got to put their boots on the ground. Can the all-volunteer force do it? And stay in Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria and the 32 other countries around the world that were doing humanitarian missions or whatever.
He said he'd support reinstating the draft if our military needs it, and that's not all.
You also seem pretty adamant that if we bring back the draft, it can't be just men 18 and over.
I think if you have a draft to do anything other than draft men and women, you are speaking with a forked tongue.
He served with the first female four-star general and says times have changed.
With the exception of the people who are serving now, America doesn't have any skin in any of the games we're playing.
With a skyrocketing budget for benefits and reenlistment bonuses and less than 1% of Americans serving in our all-volunteer military, Mellinger says a draft might eliminate a lot of public apathy. He says while current events often seem as if the worst to come is unfolding before us, history is the best perspective.
The draft is not a new thing. There were riots in this country over the draft during the Korean War. You could buy your way out in the Civil War. You could pay for one of your employees to take your place.
Mellinger says the way we fight wars today would get around a lot of the old exemptions.
And even people with physical problems can sit behind a keyboard these days, so maybe those deferments would change.
Considering the course his life took, how that draft letter he didn't ask for molded him into the leader he became, he says it's all about embracing your unseen potential.
This country is full of residents and some citizens, and the difference is citizens give back, residents just take.
Whatever unfolds, he hopes it will spark a conversation for people to be more involved, intentional, and appreciative.
You know, whatever it is, everybody ought to do something, because that gives you an appreciation for the things you have and the things you benefit from.
Nicole Kreitz, 3 TV.
Certainly something to talk about. And in our history, there have been 4 drafts, all of them in the 20th century. It started with World War I when 2.8 million Americans were called to service. The largest draft, let's see, of course, was in World War II when 10 million Americans were drafted. And then in Korea, you have about 1.5 million Americans drafted. And of course, the Vietnam War when 8 million Americans were drafted. Right now, there are 1.4 million active troops here in the U.S.
And so war is what the world got after the formation of the Federal Reserve there in America just before Christmas in 1913. And within 6 months we saw the outworking of this plan to bringing in the New World Order with the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand there in Sarajevo in June of 1914, which was the event which started off World War I. And this was all according to a plan that was laid out in the previous century by a man called Albert Pike with the help of 3 other leading Freemasons. Albert Pike was born in 1809 in Boston, studied at Harvard, then later served as Brigadier General in the Confederate Army. After the Civil War he was found guilty of treason and jailed. He was pardoned by fellow Freemason President Andrew Johnson in 1866, with whom he met at the White House the very next day. The only monument to a Confederate general in Washington, D.C. was erected in Pike's honour. Pike was one of the founding fathers and head of the ancient accepted Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, being the Grand Commander of North American Freemasonry from 1859 to 1891. In 1869 he was the top leader of the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, and in 1871 wrote the Masonic Handbook, The Morals and Dogma of the Ancient Accepted Rite of Freemasonry. And so Albert Pike's greatest claim to fame would be that as a 33rd degree leading Freemason in America there in Charlottesville, South Carolina, he set up the Palladian Rite with the help of a Jesuit by the name of John Peter de Smet Mazzini in Rome in Italy, where Mussolini came out of from a lodge there in Italy at the time of the Second World War. And likewise Otto von Bismarck, the leader of the Prussian Parliament and also the man who was most responsible for setting up the Second Reich in Germany, the First Reich being the Holy Roman Empire and the Third Reich being Adolf Hitler, who came up out of that lodge in Germany, and also Lord Henry Palmerston, who was a Knight of the Order of the Garter and the leading Freemason in England at the time, was also part of this Palladian Rite. And so he was the Prime Minister of England at the time of the Opium Wars in China, and also was Queen Victoria's Foreign Secretary. And so these are the men that set up this Palladian Rite that took over all the Western lodges from that time on. And we know, for example, that Albert Pike wrote a letter to Giuseppe Mazzini in August of 1871, and this is what he said about 3 world wars. The First World War must be brought about in order to permit the Illuminati to overthrow the power of the Tsars in Russia, and of making that country a fortress of atheistic communism. The divergences caused by the Agentur, that is the agents of the Illuminati, between the British and Germanic empires would be used to foment this war. At the end of the war, communism will be built and used in order to destroy the other governments and in order to weaken the religions. And so here we see the outworking of the First World War was in fact the overtaking of the Tsar of Russia, and he was deposed and executed, and communism was established, and Russia became a fortress of atheistic communism. And this was financed by the bankers there in Wall Street. For example, we know that Jacob Schiff boasted on his deathbed that he gave $20 million in gold to the Russian Revolution. And so the Jews from Wall Street were financing the Jews in Russia, who were the Red Army, fighting the White Army, the native white people. And so the Federal Reserve created a Great Depression in the 1930s, which was the very opposite to the thing that it was supposed to do, which was to create economic stability. And so let's turn our attention now back to the plan of the international bankers, which is described in this letter between Albert Pike and Giuseppe Mazzini. The Second World War must be fomented by taking advantage of the differences between the fascists and the political Zionists. This war must be brought about so that Nazism is destroyed, and so that political Zionism be strong enough to institute a sovereign state of Israel in Palestine. And of course in 1948 Israel declared independence after they had bombed the King David Hotel. During the Second World War, international communism must be strong enough in order to balance Christendom, which would then be restrained and held in check until the time that we would need it for the final social cataclysm. And after the Second World War, of course, communism was made strong enough, and also we know that weaker governments were being taken over, and in 1945 at the Potsdam Conference between Truman, Churchill and Stalin, a large portion of Europe was simply handed over to Russia. And on the other side of the world, the aftermath of the war with Japan helped to sweep the tide of communism into China. So let's return now to the letter written by Albert Pike to Giuseppe Mazzini. The Third World War must be fomented by taking advantage of the differences caused by the agentur of the Illuminati between the political Zionists and the leaders of the Islamic world. The war must be conducted in such a way that Islam and political Zionism mutually destroy each other. Meanwhile, the other nations, once more divided on this issue, will be constrained to fight to the point of complete physical, moral, spiritual and economic exhaustion. We shall unleash the nihilists and the atheists, and we shall provoke a formidable social cataclysm which in all its horror will show clearly to the nations the effect of absolute atheism, that is, the origin of savagery and of the most bloody turmoil. Then everywhere the citizens, obliged to defend themselves against a world minority of revolutionaries, will exterminate those destroyers of civilization, and the multitude, disillusioned with Christianity, whose deistic spirits will from that moment on be without compass or direction, anxious for an ideal but without knowing where to render its adoration, will receive the true light through the universal manifestation of the pure doctrine of Lucifer, brought finally out into the public view. This manifestation will result from the general reactionary movement which will follow the destruction of Christianity and atheism, both conquered and exterminated at the same time. And so let's have a look now at a speech given by a rabbi back in 1952 there in Budapest in Hungary. And this was to all the rabbis talking about World War III. We're going to begin by looking at this book called Pawns in the Game by William Guy Carr. And in this book it points out the speech that was given by Rabbi Emanuel Rabinovich way back in 1952 in Budapest, Hungary, to a meeting of the Emergency Council of Rabbis. And so let's have a look at this speech now that was given. Greetings, my children. You have been called here to recapitulate the principal steps of our new program. As you know, we had hoped to have 20 years between wars to consolidate the great gains which we made from World War II. But our increasing numbers in certain vital areas is arousing opposition to us, and we must now work within every means at our disposal to precipitate World War III within 5 years. And of course, the Korean War happened 5 years after the end of World War II, and also the takeover of China and the Communist Revolution. And so this is the beginning of World War III. A goal which we have striven so concertedly for 3,000 years is at last within our reach, and because its fulfillment is so apparent, it behooves us to increase our efforts and our caution tenfold. I can safely promise you that before 10 years have passed, our race will take its rightful place in the world, with every Jew a king and every Gentile a slave. Applause from the gathering. You remember the success of our propaganda campaign during the 1930s, which aroused anti-American passions in Germany. At the same time, we were arousing anti-German passions in America, a campaign which culminated in the Second World War. A similar propaganda campaign is now being waged intensively throughout the world. A war fever is being worked up in Russia by an incessant anti-American barrage, while a nationwide anti-communist scare is sweeping America. This campaign is forcing all of the smaller nations to choose between the partnership of Russia or an alliance with the United States, and of course this represents the Cold War years, doesn't it? Our most pressing problem at the moment is to inflame the lagging militaristic spirit of the Americans. The failure of the Universal Military Training Act was a great setback to our plans, but we are assured that a suitable measure will be rushed through Congress immediately after the 1952 elections. The Russians, as well as the Asiatic peoples, are well under control and offer no objections to war, but we must wait to secure the Americans. This we hope to do with the issue of anti-Semitism, which works so well on the United Americans against Germany. We're counting heavily on reports of anti-Semitic outrages in Russia to help whip up indignation in the United States and produce a front of solidarity against the Soviet power. Simultaneously, to demonstrate to Americans the reality of anti-Semitism, we will advance through news sources large sums of money to outspokenly anti-Semitic elements in America to increase their effectiveness, and we shall stage anti-Semitic outbreaks in several of their largest cities. This will serve the double purpose of exposing reactionary movements in America, which can be silenced, and of welding the United States into a devoted anti-Russian unit. Within 5 years, this program will achieve its objective, the Third World War, which will surpass in destruction all previous contests. Israel, of course, will remain neutral, and when both sides are devastated and exhausted, will arbitrate, sending a control commission into all wrecked countries. This war will end for all time a struggle against Gentiles. We will openly reveal our identity to the races of Africa and Asia. I can state with assurance that the last generation of white children is now being born. Our control commissions will, in the interest of peace and wiping out interracial tensions, forbid the whites to mate with whites. The white woman must cohabit with members of the dark races and white men with black women. Thus the white race will disappear, for mixing the dark with the white means the end of the white man, and our most dangerous enemy will only become a memory. We shall embark upon an era of 10,000 years of peace and plenty, the Pax Judaica, and our race will rule undisputed over the world. Our superior intelligence will easily enable us to retain mastery over a world of dark peoples. Question from the gathering. Rabbi Rabinovich, what about various religions after the Third World War? Rabinovich, there will be no more religions. Not only will the existence of a priest class remain a constant danger to our rule, but belief in an afterlife would give spiritual strength to irreconcilable elements in many countries and enable them to resist us. We will, however, retain the rituals and customs of Judaism as a mark of our hereditary ruling caste, strengthening our racial laws so that no Jew will be allowed to marry outside our race, nor will any stranger be accepted by us. We may have to repeat the grim days of World War II when we were forced to let the Hitlerite bandits sacrifice some of our people in order that we may have adequate documentation and witnesses to legally justify our trial and execution of the leaders of America and Russia as war criminals after we have dictated the peace. I'm sure you will need little preparation for such a duty, for sacrifice has always been a watchword of our people, and the death of a few thousand Jews in exchange for world leadership is indeed a small price to pay. To convince yourself of the certainty of that leadership, let me point out to you how we've turned all of the inventions of the white man into weapons against him. His printing presses and radios are the mouthpieces of our desires, and his heavy industry manufactures the instruments which he sends out to arm Asia and Africa against him. Our interests in Washington are greatly extending the Point 4 program for developing industry in backward areas of the world, so that after the industrial plants and cities of Europe and America are destroyed by atomic warfare, the whites can offer no resistance against the large masses of the dark races, who will maintain an unchallenged technological superiority. And so, with the vision of world victory before you, go back to your countries and intensify your good work until that approaching day when Israel will reveal herself in all her glorious destiny as the light of the world. Illuminati means holder of the light.
Hours before, in the suburbs of New York City, an evil and sadistic man brutally stabbed Jewish Americans at a rabbi's home during their Hanukkah services. Everyone here today stands in unwavering solidarity with our Jewish brothers and sisters. And together, all of us, we're going to eradicate the sinister scourge of anti-Semitism. And we will protect Jewish communities and all members of the Jewish faith from the wicked forces of hatred and violence. And you know that, and the love by evangelicals, Christians, for Jewish people and for Israel is incredible. It's incredible. We will not rest until the horrible and vile ideology of anti-Semitism has been defeated and destroyed. For this reason, I recently signed an executive order to restrict federal funding to any college or university that spreads, supports, or promotes anti-Semitic prejudice in any form.
Now to Australia, where they're facing those massive fires, already among the worst in that country's history, with more than 12 million acres scorched. And officials are warning the next few days will be even worse. Maggie Rulli is there in New South Wales, Australia, for us this morning with the latest. Good morning, Maggie.
Robin, the family who lives here tells me they have been battling back these flames for the past 2 weeks, getting as little as a couple hours of sleep every night. People here are exhausted, and unfortunately, it looks like things are just going to get worse. This morning, a mass evacuation underway as thousands flee their homes, escaping an apocalyptic sight in Australia. The massive bushfires now visible from space, engulfing the size of more than 50 New York cities.
The end will come like a flood. War will continue until the end, and desolations have been decreed.